My name is Serge Cipko, and in Ukrainian it's Serge Cipko, and I am the Assistant Director for Research at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies and also the Coordinator of the Ukrainian Diaspora Studies Initiative at the Cool Ukrainian-Canadian Studies Center at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. My book, Ukrainians in Argentina, was published in 2011, and there's also a Ukrainian edition that has come out. And I believe there's also interest in doing a Spanish edition, but we shall see how that goes. The inspiration behind that book came from my doctoral dissertation, my PhD. I was a PhD student at the University of Alberta, and I defended a doctoral dissertation on Ukrainian immigration to Argentina in the period between the two world wars. Now, the book differs from that dissertation in a couple of major respects. One is that I extended the chronology, the time frame from 1920 to 1939 to 1897 to 1950, so that I could encompass the three major waves of Ukrainian immigration that took place in Argentina. The other way that it differs is that the focus was mostly on organizations, Ukrainian organizations, when they were created, by whom, and why some immigrants decided to choose one organization over another. In South America specifically, there were two major destinations for Ukrainian immigrants. One was Brazil, and the other one was Argentina. Very few Ukrainian immigrants went to the other countries before World War I. Brazil took the lion's share of immigrants from Ukraine, and most of the immigrants from Ukraine to Brazil came from Galicia, from the Austro-Hungarian region of Galicia, very few from Bukovyna. And in Argentina, there was an immigration wave that came from Galicia and settled in the northeastern province of Misiones. So it was a sparsely populated region, subtropical, and that is where probably around 5,000 or so immigrants from Galicia settled. Mostly ethnic Ukrainians, but some Poles as well. Simultaneously, there were some immigrants that came from Bukovyna. Some of them settled on the land, again in Misiones. Some of them just came as seasonal laborers. And there were some Ukrainians from the Russian Empire that came as labor migrants. And not many of them settled on the land. So they came from various regions, but the most stable group was the one that settled in Misiones, and then there were some smaller groups that settled in other provinces of Argentina. Before World War I, there were some estimates that the community may have been somewhere between 10,000 to 15,000 in Argentina. And in Brazil, we're talking about around 35,000 to 40,000 Ukrainian immigrants and their offspring. Before World War I. Now, there was a much larger influx that came in the period before World War II in Argentina, and not as many to Brazil. And in this particular case, we're talking about perhaps as many as 70,000 or more that came from mostly Western Ukraine, but the immigrants came from all regions of Ukraine, even from the Ukrainian ethnographic territory, such as Kuban. This influx between the two world wars, was significant in a larger Argentine context, because Italians and Spaniards tended to be the largest groups immigrating to Argentina. But in the 1930s, the bulk of immigrants came from Poland, and that meant Ukrainians, Jews, in addition to ethnic Poles, some ethnic Germans, from Poland. So 58% of the immigrants in the 1930s came from Poland, and Ukrainians formed a significant share of that immigration. And they had an impact in a couple of provinces in particular. Misiones again, because many of the Ukrainians in the interwar period settled in Misiones. They were cultivating yerba mate, which is a local crop tea, from which a tea is made. They cultivated cotton in places such as the Chaco province, and formed a significant share of the population there in certain districts. They also there was a significant community in Mendoza, which is the wine producing area of Argentina. And then in Buenos Aires itself, they were part of the labor force for the meat packing plants there, the so-called frigorificos. One thing that did surprise me was when I was engaging in comparing the immigration to South America with the immigration to North America. So we see one pattern. We see several patterns. The first one is that the immigration to South America was much smaller than the immigration to North America in the period before World War I. But we see something different happening in the 1920s and 1930s. It's possible that Argentina was the largest recipient of Ukrainian immigrants in the period between the two world wars in the 1920s and 1930s in the Americas. Certainly, it looks like there were more immigrants, Ukrainian immigrants, settling in South America as a whole compared to the number of Ukrainians settling in North America as a whole in the 20s and 30s. Also, there seems to have been a much larger proportion of immigrants from Volhynia going to South America compared to the number going to North America. And one way that this is manifested is the fact that in Paraguay, the vast majority of the immigrants were Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, as opposed to Greek Catholic, Ukrainian Catholic, which tended to be the case in other areas of Ukrainian settlement. The other matter that also perhaps surprised me was the strength of the pro-Soviet organizations in Argentina in particular, but also in Uruguay. Those two places seem to have had very strong pro-Soviet organizations. The Ukrainians were welcomed in the province of Misiones because this was an area that was sparsely populated, and it was wedged. It was an area or a region that was wedged between Brazil and Paraguay, and by having such a sparse population, the Argentine government was a little bit concerned that they could probably lose that territory if there was ever going to be a conflict with one of its neighbors. When the first Ukrainians arrived in Misiones, there was some support that was given them. Notwithstanding that, there were always going to be some hardships. There's a historiographical section in the book that discusses the works that preceded mine, and of course, it made my job easier. It does differ, I suppose, in one respect from some of the other works, in the sense that I had the very good fortune of being able to travel to both Argentina and to Ukraine and mine the archives there. So in that respect, it differs, from many of the other works. And again, I was fortunate that I was able to write this dissertation in Canada because we have a very good collection of materials on Ukrainian history here. There are many Ukrainian sources, and we have an interlibrary loan system at the University of Alberta. We have sources we have books on Latin America. So in that respect, I think I was very fortunate in being able to have access to many sources. They had no problem in terms of setting up organizations. So, for example, there was a Prosvita association, or Chitalny, these reading rooms, the reading clubs that appeared already before World War One. And then the Prosvita Society itself became established in 1928, and they were able to set up branches right across the country. And then the other organizations did the same. There was a pro-Soviet organization. They were able to exist on and off, depending on what government was in power at the time, because they were pro-Soviet. There was a crackdown on that organization during certain years in the 1930s. But they also were able to establish an organization together with the Belarusians. There were some Belarusian immigrants in Argentina. They proliferated with the passage of time, beginning in the 1920s, 30s, and then during the World War II era. In terms of assimilation, yes, there was a pressure on immigrants to assimilate, but Argentina had more immigrants per capita than most other countries. There was a very large foreign-born population in Argentina. And the other thing that is worth mentioning is, and in this respect, Argentina is similar to Canada, and that is that the population to begin with was not that huge. So when the Ukrainians arrived in the 1920s, the population of Argentina was somewhere between 10 to 12 million people. I think Canada's population was similar at that time. It was probably around 10, 11 million. I'd have to check, but in any case, they're quite comparable. So it means that in a place like Misiones, where Ukrainians, the number of Ukrainians already by 1914 was estimated to be as high as about 7,500, and that is both the foreign-born and the Argentines of Ukrainian origin who were born in Argentina, or the Argentine-born, and that became like a good place for the churches to establish themselves. In the book, I talk about the efforts to start the Ukrainian Catholic Church in Misiones, and what happened when it was difficult for a priest to be sent to Argentina, because as a result of the delay in having a priest of the Ukrainian Catholic Church come to serve the community in Misiones, the Russian Orthodox Church filled part of that vacuum. So I explain the evolution of the Ukrainian Catholic Church in Misiones, and also the appearance of the Russian Orthodox Church there. Then a transition that had occurred to the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, and also the Protestant groups that Ukrainians among the who were Protestants in places such as Misiones. The greatest interaction was with the Ukrainian communities in Paraguay and Uruguay. In fact, what you find is that, on the various levels. One level is that the subscribers to the Ukrainian press in Buenos Aires, they had subscribers. The Ukrainian press in Buenos Aires, newspapers like Ukrainskie Slovo, and if it was the pro-Soviet newspaper, it would be called Svitlo. They had subscribers in Uruguay and Paraguay. Also, priests, who would travel from would travel across the border, from Argentina into Paraguay, Argentina to Uruguay. There would be letters from individuals in Paraguay and Uruguay that would appear in the Buenos Aires Ukrainian language newspapers. And then ties with the homeland. That occurred as well, but of course, with the World War II, that's interrupted the ties between Ukrainians in South America and their relatives. But one phenomenon that occurred was the so-called Soviet Return-to-the-Homeland campaign. So after in the 1950s, after 1955, there was a campaign, worldwide campaign, that was trying to encourage people who had ties with people who were immigrants in the Americas and elsewhere, and came from the territory of the Soviet Union to resettle, to go back to the Soviet Union. Now, the way that this played itself out in South America, and especially in Argentina, is that many of the immigrants who were pro-Soviet had already applied to return to Soviet Ukraine or Soviet Belarus. These were the two major groups, or Lithuania, after World War II, but they weren't they weren't encouraged to resettle then. But under Khrushchev, they were encouraged. Nikita Khrushchev this campaign was really targeting post-World War II refugees, but it was the pro-Soviet groups who responded most enthusiastically. So you had several thousand Ukrainians and Belarusians in particular, and some other groups who resettled from South America to Soviet Ukraine and Soviet Belarus. So this is one example of the ties that had occurred. What had happened subsequently is that many of the people who did resettle, and remember, these were people from Western Ukraine. They weren't. They were not immigrants or the descendants who had origins in Soviet Ukraine. So they had no real experience with the Soviet Union. And the ones who were born in Argentina or Uruguay were the ones who most wanted to go back to South America, and some of them were able to do so. I should mention that among the books that I have written is one that I co-authored with Glenna Roberts on the Soviet Return-to-the-Homeland campaign. That one focuses on Canada, but there are many references to South America there as well. It's called a one-way ticket, the Soviet Return-to-the-Homeland campaign, 1955-1960. There are individuals that did produce works. One is Yevhen Odnatsky. He produced a multi-volume encyclopedia of Ukraine. Another person, who's worth emphasizing, and this can go back to your question about ties with the Ukraine, is the artist Victor Tsembal, because he produced many paintings, and he also did a lot of illustrations for the Ukrainian yearbooks. He was from the Kiev region and immigrated to Argentina in the 1920s. And worked as a commercial artist, and became his income was a little higher than than the average Ukrainian immigrant, and he also was he was like a mecenat. He actually supported some local Ukrainian causes financially. During the time of the Ukrainian famine, 32-33, he was receiving reports that there were refugees Ukrainian refugees in Romania, and he had heard that they were being sent back because the Romanian authorities said that they couldn't be supported. So in order to prevent as many of these refugees from being deported back to Soviet Ukraine, he began raising money among immigrants, among Ukrainians and other immigrants in Argentina. So you see the list of donors to a particular fund that is sent to Romania. Many Ukrainian names, but you also see some non-Ukrainian names among them. In 1934, he produced this very large painting, which is now in New York, called Rik 33, the year 1933, which is about the famine. And so this particular work is one that I think many people in Ukraine and in the diaspora are aware of. It's a painting that has appeared in many books and in covers of works about the famine. There have been members of parliament of Ukrainian origin. There's been a senator of Ukrainian origin in the areas where Ukrainians have settled. In a very significant way. Then you also have members, mayors of towns and cities, and councillors. So there's been a mayor, for example, of the town of Berisa, which is a suburb of La Plata, the city of La Plata, which is the provincial capital of Buenos Aires. I wouldn't say that. It certainly hasn't been as pronounced or as prevalent, put it this way. It hasn't been as prevalent as it would be for Canada, for example. But they have played a role in national and local politics. There wasn't really any immigration after 1950. Except for there was two streams. One was the Ukrainians who had gone to the Soviet Union or to Soviet Ukraine in the 1950s and then came back in the 1960s, and they were allowed to go. Those people who were allowed to resettle back in Argentina, or there was a significant number of Ukrainians who left the Ukrainian community in Paraguay and settled in Argentina over time, already beginning with the turn of the 1940s, and that trend continued into the 60s. So there were Ukrainians from Paraguay that resettled in Argentina. What you do find is there's, much like in Canada, there's an interest in Ukrainian dance. So there are some Ukrainian dance ensembles right across Argentina. You still have an equivalent to the Ukrainian Canadian Congress there, the Ukrainian Central Representation, which is an umbrella body that embraces a number of Ukrainian organizations and their branches. There are churches there. In fact, the Patriarch of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, or Hnatiuk, had served in Argentina. He was a bishop in Argentina, for a while. And there's also a Ukrainian Baptist community in Argentina today. And often when politicians visit Ukraine from Argentina, there's an ambassador who visits, or there's a minister who visits Ukraine from Argentina. They'll make mention of the local Ukrainian community. They're aware that it exists, and I believe Argentina was one of the one of the first countries. So certainly was they recognized Ukraine very early on after when Ukraine declared its independence, and that was confirmed with the referendum in December 1991. They only began the credit unions after World War II. Yeah, they had the 3 credit unions, and they don't have any anymore because during a period of economic recession, the credit unions are folded. And have a great weekend. Thanks for watching.